to go. You're all very welcome tonight to our third talk on a series of talks on the War of Independence and Civil War. Just before we start, I would like to pay tribute to one of our long-standing members who is no longer with us, Paddy Ryan Cooney. Paddy was an annual contributor to our historical journal, Mining the Past. In our 2014 edition, Paddy wrote a story titled The Anglesey Line and the Priest Who Suggested a Road to Civilization. As many of you would have known, Paddy lived just off a section of the Anglesey Line, which connects Neenah to Tipperary town. I'm sure Paddy would have been amused to see the traffic jam on the Anglesey Road on that Sunday afternoon of his funeral. To May, Paddy, Cora and the extended Ryan Cool family, we pass on our deepest sympathy. Now, just thanks to Martin and Mary Ryan for the use of their premises. The Ryan Lacken family has been very supportive of our historical society since our first meeting in January 2012. Thanks also to Joe and David for videoing the talks. These three talks, Tullum Island Ambush, Paddy Ryan Lacken and Andy Cooney, are available on YouTube, thanks to Joe and David. Also, thanks to Paddy and Jim there for helping out with us this evening as well. So we come to tonight's topic. Andy Cooney, Republican and medical doctor, was born in Ballyphillip in our parish here in Silvermines on the 22nd of April 1897. During his medical studies in UCD, he became involved in the War of Independence and later the Civil War. He was appointed Chief of Staff of the IRA on the 18th of November 1925 and held that position until October 26. One of his last public engagements in Ireland before leaving for America was to formally open the Paddy Ryan Lacken Park in Newport on Sunday the 21st of May 1950. Sean Gaynor introduced Cooney to the crowd and stated he was a great soldier and a great leader, and in his opinion ranked with the patriot whose memory they were honouring that day, Paddy Ryan Lacken. We are delighted to have Cait here this evening to tell us more about this amazing man. Cait, a relation of Andy Cooney's and also a mineswoman, has been a member of our historical society since its foundation in 2012 and has been an annual contributor to our historical journal, Mining the Past. In fact, in our first publication in 2012, Cait wrote about Andy Cooney, IRA activist and medical man, 1897 to 1968. Remember that, Cait? So, without any further ado, I now hand you over to Cait. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. Now, with a green ushla agus a chuirde, here a churm lautliv tronuna fui hail agus hail ri Andy Cooney. Fair a sail intag achtrúil Valagawan, ach Valaghele sail G-Mark Wigna Kavige, go Hordhe Gedere. Now I met or rather saw Andy Cooney as a child when he came to our house in Bonn to visit my father before he left for America in November 1950. That's a long time ago. But I remember that it was a wild, wintry November night and that a knock came to the door and my father went out and he said, oh, it's Andy Cooney. And there was a sort of a frisson of excitement. But they were brought, I think there were two other people with him, big tall man, and they were brought into the parlour and we children didn't see him anymore. Now, Andy Cooney's exploits and activities during the War of Independence have been recorded in many books, especially in Dublin Made Me by Todd Andrews, and also in the McGarty papers by Sean Cronin, The Secret Army by Bob Bell, Green Against Green by Michael Hopkinson, books by Ernie O'Malley, The Gaynor Book, and The Gates Flew Open by Peadar O'Donnell. and they're only the ones that I know about. But a full biography by Michael McAvilly was published in 2011. And there it is. That's the one by Michael McAvilly. And I've used that in the preparation of this talk. And I've also used Bureau of Military History statements. Now, Andy didn't make a statement to the Bureau, but he did apply for a pension in 1935, and I had a look at that. As well as that, other people's statements contain many references to him. And I also used newspaper reports and family information. Now, as Dennis said, he was born in Ballyphillip in 1897, one of 3 children. He had an older brother, Patrick or Paddy, and a younger sister, Maureen. His parents were Mary Ann Gleeson of Bawn and John Cooney of Ballyphillip. John was also known as Boss Cooney and was originally from Ballyvaughan, Portrue. And the farm at Ballyphillip was purchased for him by his father, Pat, sometime before his marriage, probably in the early 1890s. Now, this is, let me see who we have here. Don't tell me I'm in trouble already, Dennis, here. No, it is.
Turn it back to the laptop.
Sorry. Sorry about that. I didn't think that was going to happen.
I'll move it on YouTube.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
You could move it on down there. Thanks a million, Dennis. Sorry about that. This is really... Oh yeah, I have it now. Might work here. Ah, we have it here. This is working as well. Now, there he is, the man himself. That's the man in question. And now, that's his grandparents, or they are his grandparents, I should say. His grandfather was the man, Pat, who bought the farm in Ballyphillip, and his wife, Bridget Corbett, who was from Killaloe. Now, Pat was something of a political activist. He was a member of the RB and he was engaged in land league activities. In fact, he looks like one of the old Fenians. If you remember Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa or John O'Leary from your school books, they had beards there must have been the fashion in 1867. Now, bad heart. Now, that's Andy's father, Boss Cooney. Now, we don't know of any political activities that he was engaged in, certainly at the beginning of his life, but he was very interested in hurling and farming, and he was one of the founders of the Nina Co-op. And he was a very elegant gentleman there with his cravat and his watch. And that's Andy's mother, Mary Ann Gleeson. Now, she was my grandaunt, and I think she was related to quite a few people here. And a very elegant lady, and she's got her fan. And that's her sister, Lizzie Gleeson of Bawn. Now, she lived all her life in Bawn. She looks like a blind lady there, but she wasn't. And she lived in the house that I grew up in, and we often heard stories about her. And she's there with her niece, Molly Harty of Tumivara, later Molly O'Mara of Balnagrass. And they were obviously on their holidays because that large building behind them has Ross Hotel written on it, so it was probably in Killarney. And now we have Boss Cooney and Maureen and Paddy Cooney. That Mary Ann Gleeson or Mary Ann Cooney died in 1930, so that was probably maybe after she died, so the 3 of them are there. And another one from Ballyphillip long ago, That's Mary Ann Cleary of Lisson Hall, her sisters Peggy and Noreen, and that's Maureen Cooney, and that's Paddy Cooney on the right with the dog. And in between them is Nellie O'Leary of Beechwood. She was later Nellie Harriet. You probably remember Nellie Harriet's chemist shop in town. And I went to school with her daughter, who looked like the image of her. And that's from Ballyphilip long ago, about, well, maybe not 1920, but certainly in the 1920s. Now, Andy went to school in Lisson Hall, and then to Nina, and after he also spent some time in O'Connell schools in Dublin. And he entered UCD in 1916 to study medicine. And while there, he was very involved in hurling. And, sorry, I've got myself lost here now. While there, he was very involved in hurling, and he was on the collegians team that won the Dublin County Championship in 1918 and 1919. But it was not all hurling. He joined the Volunteers C Company of the 3rd Battalion in 1917. The OC was Simon Donnelly, and he went into the IRB, or was inducted into the IRB in 1918. And from then on, republicanism was his passion. He never deviated from the goal of achieving an independent united republic in Ireland by physical force. Now, we have a description of him by a Kerry man called Con Casey. There he is. And this is what Con Casey said, and I quote, "Facially and physically, he was a very fine-looking man. However, he was rather withdrawn, definitely not the sort who would laugh or crack jokes. He had a capacity, strange to say, even though he was a young man, to overawe people. He did not come forward towards you very much. We respected him, but we did not get close to him. He was a good organiser and a strict disciplinarian. And I may also add that he never supported any political party and never moderated his views. He was involved in the War of Independence in 3 different locations, in Dublin and Tipperary and Kerry, and I'm just going to deal with Dublin and Tipperary. Of course, such dedication didn't help with his medical studies. He didn't turn up for his exam in 1917 and was marked absent. And he didn't turn up in 1918 either, because he was in jail. He was given 2 months in jail for illegal drilling, spent the first 2 weeks in Mountjoy and the rest of it in Crumlin Road in Belfast. And when he was released, he came home to Ballyphilip until the following January. And while he was at home, he got involved with training of the volunteers locally, and it was thought because he was in Dublin, he had a bit more expertise than the locals. He said himself with some sarcasm that because he had seen a Mills bomb, he was thought to be an expert. He was involved in the raid on Castle Otway. They had a raid for arms in 1918, in September. I think he was asked to go by Sean Gaynor. And back in Dublin in early 1919, he and other members of his company, C Company, 3rd Battalion, they acted as stewards at the first meeting of Dáil Éireann. And after that, he seems to have got down to his studies because he did pass his first med that summer. And when he came home for the holidays, he again joined up with the locals, especially with Ned O'Leary, and there wasn't a lot of action because both the OC, Frank McGrath, and the Vice OC, Bill Hoolan, were in jail. Back in Dublin in 1920, there was no lack of action. The IRA intelligence discovered that Sir Thomas Esmond from Wexford had brought all his guns up and put them into the St. Stephen's Green Club for safekeeping. He was going to hand them over to the authorities. And Andy and a few of his companions from his, the C Company, they just walked in, picked them up, wrapped the long ones in brown paper and walked down Dawson Street and got away. And they were very lucky that a party of Black and Tans were in process of, they were involved in a raid on the Mansion House while they were passing. Now, Sir Thomas Esmond had been a member of he was a member of the Irish Parliamentary Party. He'd been an MP, and he was a staunch Home Ruler, but he lost his seat in the 1918 election. Back home for the summer, and he played a leading part in the attack on Borrisokane Barracks on September the 26th, 1920. A few days before the attack, he and Jim Devaney of Palace Tumivara, who was a pharmacy student and shared digs with him some of the time, they were sent to Dublin to collect grenades and bombs, and they collected them in 44 Parnell Square, brought them home in suitcases on the train to Cloughjordan. Now, as most of you know, elaborate plans were made for the preparation of the attack, and some of the accounts say 150 men, say more than that, were involved. And Ned O'Leary was in charge of blockading the roads, and petrol was sourced or acquired or stolen and taken and stored in a sandpit in Cullenwayne. And the plan was to break into the barracks from an adjoining house. And Andy and Michael Kennedy were said to have done most of the hard work on the roof with hammers and hatchets trying to break through. And eventually they did, and they found difficulty with netting, and eventually they got bombs put in and the barracks went on fire. And as you probably know as well, 2 people were injured. Jimmy O'Mara of Tumivara, who recovered, and Michael Kennedy, and he was more seriously injured. They were evacuated via Kilbarn, and Michael Kennedy was, Jimmy O'Mara was left with the priest in Puckane who brought him home in a pony and trap, and Michael Kennedy was brought to Slattery's pub in Ballycommon. And Andy Cooney cycled into Nina to get Dr. Courtney, brought out Dr. Louis Courtney, who had him transferred to Limerick, but to no avail. The poor man died 2 weeks later. Now, when I was on a Normand historical outing to Borrisokane in 2011, and our guide was Eamon Slevin, and he said that the account in Andy's book, in the biography, was the best he had read, the account of the attack on the barracks. And also, it was the first time I realised that Jimmy O'Mara and Michael Kennedy were shot by what we call friendly fire. So it made it even more tragic for their families that they were shot by their own men. Now, on Bloody Sunday in Dublin in November, Andy was one of a group chosen to assassinate spies, judged by Michael Collins to be causing great difficulty in the progress of the war. The men were chosen by Sean Russell under the direction of Dick McKee, and the majority were members of Michael Collins' special squad. But others were needed, and Andy and 2 other medical students, Tom Burke, whom I think was from Portumna, and Jerry Davis, were assigned to a certain room in a lodging house in Pembroke Street, in Upper Pembroke Street, where the British spies were staying. It was a very precise sort of an undertaking, and they each got special rooms. And when they got to their room, there was nobody in it. So they weren't involved in the shooting directly. But in the melee afterwards, Andy was able to take away some documents. Now, there are 2 different versions to what happened in the afternoon. In his book, Todd Andrews said, in his book Dublin Made Me, Todd Andrews said that he met Andy Cooney that afternoon in Terranure in the sports ground, the UCD sports ground, where the hurling team were practicing, or some of them, and that he felt that each knew that the other was involved in the activities in the morning, but neither of them mentioned it. And he said he invited Andy Cooney home for his tea because Todd Andrews' family lived in Terranure. Whereas what Andy Cooney wrote about it, he mentioned being in Terranure sports grounds, doesn't mention meeting Todd Andrews at all, and said that he went home to his digs and felt very uneasy and decided to go to Croke Park, even though they'd been sort of more or less told not to go near it. And he describes in detail what happened, and that he was stopped by an auxiliary and asked his name, and he told them his name, and then he was asked what county he was from. So he didn't want to say he was from Tipperary, he said he was from the King's County, and he was let go. Now, in January 1921, he volunteered to go full-time as an IRA organiser to any part of the country to which he would be assigned by General Headquarters. He was hoping to get North Tipperary, but he was assigned to Kerry with the rank of captain, and he operated there under the name of Jim Brown, and encountered many difficulties as there was dissension in the camp, especially in the number 1 Brigade in Tralee. The General Headquarters and the locals weren't on the one hymn sheet, as they said, and the locals weren't too keen on anybody coming from general headquarters. But he was quite tactful and managed to stay the course. He remained in Kerry until the truce. And after the truce came the treaty, and Andy was vehemently opposed to it. He believed that the delegates were outmanoeuvred, and he felt so strongly that he thought they should have been arrested when they came back. Between the approval of the treaty and the outbreak of the Civil War, he was involved in many incidents connected with the taking over of barracks when the British evacuated, including Templemore and Crinkle and Burr. There was a lot of jockeying for position, as it was apparent that some groups were in favour of the treaty and others were against it. And in April 1922 he was made OC of the 1st Eastern Division of the IRA, which was all the one still at that time. His task was not an easy one, as almost all that division had gone pro-treaty. It was a confusing and chaotic situation. Todd Andrews, who was appointed organising officer, said there was very little to organise. But there were many incidents with regard to barracks again in Mullingar, Drogheda and Dundalk. And at the end of 1922, Andy came back to Dublin and resigned as OC. And he went into the Four Courts, and they felt they were going to be attacked, and he decided to stay. Now, he was said to have regretted that afterwards, and I don't know why. And after the surrender, the Four Court prisoners were sent to Mountjoy prison, where they immediately demanded treatment as prisoners of war. An executive group consisting of Rory O'Connor, Lee Mellows, Joe McKelvey and Padder O'Donnell asked Andy to be OC of C Wing in the prison, and this he agreed to do, and had many confrontations and verbal jousts with the authorities. Prisoners whiled away at time by reading, writing. They had newspapers made up themselves in the prison, playing cards, and especially by digging tunnels trying to escape. They had a few engineers in the company which were a help, and they had many clashes with the Deputy Governor, Paudine O'Keefe. And here I think there is a picture of Andy in prison on the, this thing works. That man is Joe McHenry, that's Andy in the middle, and that's Joe McKelvey on the right. Now, in his book, The Gates Flew Open, this one here, Padder O'Donnell wrote a very light-hearted sort of humorous account of their time in prison. But I would just like to refer to two events that occurred while Andy was there. The first was the execution of Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Joe McKelvey and Dick Barrett. Now, Andy had been very friendly with Dick Barrett in particular, that's this man here. And he and a man called Tom McMahon, who was an engineer, Padder O'Donnell and Dick Barrett used to play bridge every afternoon. Now, it's not something playing bridge is not something we associate with prison, but that's what they did. And they played their last game on the 7th of December 1922, and cigarettes were very prized luxury in prison, and they were very scarce. And it said that Padder O'Donnell said that the other three shared one cigarette between them. And the next morning when they went to mass, the four who were executed were prayed for. So they must have got a terrible shock. And as well as that, Dick Barrett, who obviously smoked as well, he sent a note. The prisoners before they were executed were offered cigarettes, and Dick Barrett was given 20 players, and he smoked 3 of them, and he put the others, the remainder of the packet and a note, and gave them to the governor, who was Phil Cosgrave, Liam Cosgrave's brother, and asked him to give them would be shared between Andy and Tom McMahon. So Phil Cosgrave did that, and Dick Barrett also said in the note that they weren't allowed to associate before they were executed, but that was changed after he'd written the note, and Phil Cosgrave put it in the note that he gave to Andy as OC of C Wing, that they were allowed to speak together before they were executed. Now, stories went around that it was Andy was meant to be executed and not Dick Barrett, because he was, well, we were told anyway that one from each province was taken, and that they were of the higher rank, and Andy's rank was higher than Dick Barrett's. And that story came from Mickey Joe Costello of Cloughjordan, who was pro-treaty, but he was supposed to have had a great regard for Andy always, and actually the families were very friendly in Dublin. I was talking to Andy's daughter-in-law last week, and she told me that she knew Mickey Joe Costello well. And apparently the story came from Paudin O'Keefe. And Mickey Joe Costello told that story as late as 1986 to the author, to Michael McAvilly, the man who wrote the book. Apparently it occurred because the executions were decided on very quickly. They happened in reprisal or in reaction to the shooting the previous day of two pro-treaty TDs, Sean Hales and Pádraig O'Malley, who were shot by anti-treaty forces. And Sean Hales died and Pádraig O'Malley recovered. And it was decided the decision was made very quickly, and apparently when they looked for Andy Cooney in the prison, they couldn't find him. So if that is true, he had a very narrow escape. And that story was also supported by Ulick O'Connor, apparently in later years. During his time in prison, Andy was moved several times. Anytime there was a bit of a rumpus or insubordination, they were moved off. He served in Mountjoy, Arbour Hill, Newbridge, then back to Mountjoy, Kilmainham, and finally in Hare Park, the Curragh. Now, another unforgettable episode of his time in jail was the hunger strike in autumn 1923. He was very much against it, as were many of more experienced people. Over 8,000 men and 51 women took part in the hunger strike in Mountjoy, Kilmainham and Newbridge, etc., to try and get unconditional release. Apparently, it's considered very unwise to have such huge numbers involved in a hunger strike, as only people of a very particular temperament can sustain a hunger strike. And many of them couldn't, and they just drifted off, which led to low morale and hopelessness. And it was considered a failure. Now, Andy stuck it out for the 40 days, as did Peadar O'Donnell and lots more. 2 Corkmen died during that hunger strike, Dinny Barry in Newbridge and Andy O'Sullivan in Mountjoy. However, before Christmas 1923, many of the prisoners were released in small batches so that there wouldn't be any big welcome homes or anything. And Andy himself was released unconditionally in 1924, in May. He returned to UCD to resume his medical studies. And with Todd Andrews and others, he founded a Republican club. They called it a Republican club rather than a Sinn Féin club because they thought it would have a wider appeal. And through that he became friendly with Frank Ryan, a Celtic Studies student from Elton in County Limerick. Andy was also elected Chief of Staff of the IRA in 1925. Now the Civil War was over since May 1923, but as we say now, they hadn't gone away. He was succeeded Frank Aiken. And he visited America in 1926 to contact Clonerail and make sure that money that was being sent over would not be diverted to Fianna Fáil. He didn't have a passport, and he wouldn't ask the Free State government for a passport. So he travelled to England under an assumed name and managed to join in a group who were emigrating to Canada. And after much difficulty, he made contact with the people in New York, and he was collected and brought there. And he met up with many of the leaders of Clonerail, particularly Joe McGarrity in Philadelphia, and also Luke Dillon. And he signed an agreement with Joe McGarrity on behalf of the IRA as Chief of Staff that they, with regard to sending the money and who was to go to. And while he was away, Moss Toomey was Chief of Staff in his place. And when he returned home, he resigned his position, probably because he had to attend to his studies. And Moss Toomey took over, and he remained until the mid-1930s. And during those years, Andy found time to take up hurling again, and was on the Fitzgibbon Cup team from 1924 to 28. And they won the Fitzgibbon Cup in 1926-27, and here we have a picture of them. There were 3 doctors on the team. That is Andy there in the middle there. That's he. And down here we have Dr. Tommy Daly, who was from Tullen, County Clare, who died young, and there was a song written about him by Brian McMahon. Very good song. And he was a famous Clare goalkeeper. And Andrew finally qualified in 1928 and was employed in the Mater Hospital for 6 months as a house surgeon. However, at the end of that time, his prospects in Ireland were bleak, and he went to London and got a job as an assistant in a general practice. His next big undertaking was to go to America as an envoy on behalf of Coal and Republica. Now, what was Coal and Republica? Well, you might well ask. Well, when Fianna Fáil went into the Dáil in 1926, the rest of the IRA decided that they'd have to have some kind of a political organisation. So they set up Coal and Republica, with Skellig, or J.J. O'Kelly, as chairman. Now, he was the speaker in the first Dáil, and Michael Price as secretary. And it was decided then, they had the support, of Cumann as well as the IRA, and the Sinn Féin deputies, the abstentionist deputies, like Mary McSweeney and Brian O'Higgins. And it was hoped to set up a support organisation in America because they wanted to collect some money. And they were going to call it the Councils of the Irish Republic, just a translation of Coal and Republica. And it was to be an open organisation, unlike Clan Gael, which was secret, a sort of parallel organisation. Now, Andy had for some time been engaged to Frances Brady, a lady from Belfast, and they decided they would marry and she could go to America with him. So they married in University Church, St. Stephen's Green, on September the 29th, 1929. Frances' brother, Father Gerard Brady, officiated the ceremony. Moss Toomey was best man and Kay Brady bridesmaid. And Frances and Andy left immediately for America on board the Berengaria. Now, there wasn't any wedding photograph that anybody knows about, and that's just Andy himself on board the Berengaria. Frances was from Belfast. Her parents were Molly and James Brady, and James was a wealthy linen manufacturer. I have a picture here of the family, and they are the parents, Molly and James. Can we see them here? And that's James, the son James at the back. He took over the business, and Father Gerard must have been studying in Rome when that picture was taken. And these are the four daughters. I have another picture of them here, I think. Yes, there's Frances, Kay, May, and Beatrice. Now, I just speak about them for a few minutes because they were remarkable ladies. They were well before their time. They were highly educated and very independent ladies. They were all educated in St. Louis Convent, Monaghan, except Kay, who went to Loretta and Stephen's Green. Now, that's up on the right. Yes, this lady here. And after Loretta and Stephen's Green, she went to a finishing school in Mainz in Germany. And then she graduated from Queen's and from Trinity and went to university in Munich and taught at the Pembroke School in Ballsbridge. She was extremely active in Cumann and was friendly with all the leaders, of the rebellion, Ned Daly, Sean McDermott, Ade O'Reilly, and later Ernie O'Malley and Austin Stack. She really deserves a full biography. May also graduated from Queen's and was in Cumann and later married Dr. Harry Macaulay, one of the founders of Kappa Hospital. Beatrice, who was the youngest, she graduated from UCD, became an accountant and was auditor to the First Dáil. She entered the Carmelite nuns in 1924 and in Tranquilla and Rathmines, and that convent eventually closed and they moved to Knock, so she lived the latter part of her life in Knock. Now, Frances, who married Andy, this lady here in the front, you can't see her very well with the hats, she also went to a finishing school in Mainz, and then she specialised in music, studying the cello. And about 1916, she worked in the British War Office in the censorship section. She joined Cumann and did intelligence work for Michael Collins. And when war censorship ended, she returned to Belfast and enrolled in Queen's, but she didn't finish her course there, but began working for Joe McDonagh in the Belfast boycott campaign. She was sentenced to 2 years prison in Mountjoy for possession of a revolver and documents, and she took part in a hunger strike, and she was released in 1921 as part of the treaty settlement. After the Second World War, she was very involved in the Green Cross, which was saving the German children who were brought to Ireland after the war. Some of them came through the Green Cross, some through the Red Cross, which was the government organisation. And she was always very pro-German. Now, Andy and Frances had an apartment in New York, and here they are in New York, at least we have that. There they are in Central Park in New York. And they were visited there by many old comrades, including Paddy Ryan Lecken. But Andy had little success with his American mission. The whole idea was unrealistic, as the Garda were asking Clan Gael to set up what was really a rival organisation. And anyway, the clan was very suspicious of anything connected with politics, or what they would regard as anything tainted with politics. And also their timing was very unfortunate, because the Wall Street crash happened the day before the inaugural meeting. So after some weeks, Andy was totally frustrated and he resigned as envoy, and he and Francis spent a month seeing the sights before returning home in December. Then they had to face reality and go to London, where Andy worked as a locum before setting up in private practice. And their son Sean was born there in February 1931. Now, the 1930s saw many splits in the Republican movement. Say a radical socialist offshoot was set up in 1931 with Sean McBride, Mick Price and Peadar O'Donnell to the fore. But that didn't last long. And in 1934, another effort was made to bring them on a left-wing path with Frank Ryan, Peadar O'Donnell and Mick Price. And they put forward their ideas at an army convention in 1934. But they were outvoted and they were actually expelled from the IRA. And Frank Ryan ended up taking a contingent of about 80 men to fight on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. During all these disputes, Andy remained firmly on the military wing and didn't dabble in socialist politics. Now, family folklore, that's my family, has it that many of the IRA people on the run stayed in Ballyphillip in the 1930s. And in particular, Frank Ryan and Sean Russell stayed there. This Frank Ryan on the left here. And there was a story that there was a romance between Frank Ryan and Maureen Cooney, and there was even a suggestion that they were engaged. And another version of the story had it that it was Sean Russell was the man. And Sean Russell has become something of a hate figure in recent times because of his connection with Nazi Germany. However, whatever was those reported romances, Maureen ended up marrying her neighbour Jim Cleary, who was also a staunch Republican and was interned in the Curragh for about 3.5 years during the war. They married in 1944 when he was released. Now, I don't have a wedding photograph, but of this photograph taken in 1945 at the Gap of Dunloe in Killarney. And we have there on the left is Kay Brady, Maureen Cleary, Sean Cooney and his son, Francis Cooney, his wife, and Jim Cleary of Lissenhall. Now, excuse me, Peadar O'Donnell seems to have stayed a lot in Ballyphillip during the 30s and became very friendly with Boss Cooney. Here's Peadar. And Peadar was involved in campaigns about the land annuities. And Boss Cooney seems to have supported him in that. And the land was a big political question in the 30s. If you ever read the Nina Guardian, the breaking up of the big estates was the topic of the day. And if you read the Dáil reports, Dan Morrissey was asking about the Carroll estate in Lissenhall, and Martin Ryan Lecken was asking about the Trant estate in Dovey, when they would be divided. And when Boss Cooney died in 1939, there was a huge turnout at his funeral, with many public figures attending. If you read the Guardian, the obituary is this length. And according to the Guardian, there were 70 motor cars involved in the cortege in 1939. And in his book, There Will Be Another Day, Peadar O'Donnell, that book was about the land annuities campaign, said, I quote, "I held a small conference in Nina, organised by my good friend John Cooney of Ballyphillip, and I spoke to them as I would to a group by Cooney's fireside." So he obviously implies that he was in the habit of meeting people in Ballyphillip. But to get back to Andy and Francis Cooney came back to Dublin when Fianna Fáil came into power, and she met up with Sean McEntee. Now, Sean McEntee was from Belfast and a great friend of the Brady family. And she put it to him that for all that she and Andy had done for Ireland, as they would say, they deserved to be able to make their living at home. So he gave them the idea that would possibly be a job for Andy in the public service, but that he would need a postgraduate qualification. So they sold out their private practice, came back to Dublin, took temporary positions and went back to study full-time in UCD. And I think it was Frances, she had a private income, who financed that. And he got a BSc in public health in 1933, and he was eventually offered a senior post as Secretary of the Hospitals Commission, which had been set up to reorganise the hospital system and was funded by the hospital sweepstake. Now, some of you maybe remember the hospital sweepstake. Joe McGrath was the driving force behind the hospital sweepstake, which had been set up in 1931. Now, the sale of lottery tickets was illegal in America, but Joe McGrath made use of an underground network to sell the tickets, and that network was controlled by Clonagale under Joe McGarrity and later Connie Neenan. Now, the Minister for Health at that time was Sean O'Callaghan, and he was also Minister for Local Government. So most of the work with regard to health was done by the Parliamentary Secretary, Dr. Conor Ward. The new commission had to first carry out a survey of all existing hospital and nursing facilities, and then to devise schemes for the improvement and coordination of those services. Not an easy task. Many of the criticisms sound very familiar. Too many small hospitals, not enough cooperation between specialists, county hospitals were badly located, services and accommodation not up to standard. And the country was also facing a huge TB problem. Andy spent nearly 9 years as secretary, and the commission undertook the building of new hospitals, and one of the first to be opened was in Nina in 1936. I hope we have, I think we're gone again, are we? Oh no, we're okay, sorry.
I'll go back one.
No, you go back one, exactly.
1 second.
Okay, thank you. Now we see at the opening of the hospital in Nina, we see Sean O'Callaghan there. He was the minister, later president. That's Tim Sheehy, who was the chairman of the county council. I think he was a TD too, somebody might know. He was a TD in 1932, whether he was still a TD or not, I don't know. Michael Kelly was chairman of the urban council. Sean T. O'Neill was Clown Clark. And on the right is Dr. Louis Courtney, and the other two are the architect and the builder. And that was I got that picture from Brendan Tracy's collection. And another initiative of the Commission was the establishment of the Dublin Hospitals Bureau, which was known as the Bed Bureau, which to oversee and coordinate the occupancy of beds in all Dublin hospitals. Now, while Secretary of the Commission, Andy had many opportunities to travel abroad to study modern hospital development. In 1934, he went on a study tour of Switzerland with other members of the Commission, and this was organised by the International Hospital Association, and 39 countries were represented. In 1935, he was one of the lecturers at the IHA conference in Rome, and the following year he was principal speaker at the IHA function in Czechoslovakia. In 1937, he was appointed chairman of one of the IHA study committees, and the name of the committee was Planning of Work and Critical Assessment of Results. And one of the first items for study was to define a minimum standard for the size of a hospital. And Andy's suggestion of 600 beds was accepted. And during this time, Andy collaborated and kept in touch with the League of Nations in Geneva. Now, much of the work of the IHA ceased at the outbreak of the Second World War. The war brought an end to international travel. Though Andy and his wife, Frances, stayed on very friendly terms socially with many Fianna Fáil people, especially Todd Andrews, Sean T. O'Callaghan, Tommaso Derrick, the authorities were probably well aware of his IRA activities. And because of the war situation and Ireland's neutrality, Andy was asked to sign a loyalty pledge in 1941, and this he refused to do. And he had to resign. He was then in a very difficult situation. Times were turbulent and there was a crackdown on the IRA and many were interned. Andy was at Bodenstown commemoration in 1944, accompanied by Sean McBride. Now, even in my day, in the 1960s in Dublin, Bodenstown was the big Republican day out. And how do we know he was there? Because it was recorded by military surveillance, and his telephone tap wasn't removed until the end of the war in 1945. But his life was very unsettled, his marriage was in difficulties, and he was depending on temporary positions, and he was felt he would have to go abroad. He resigned from the IRA in 1944, never gave a reason, but he still supported them, of course. We are now very familiar with the term refugees and all that implies. In 1945, they were known as displaced persons, and there were millions of them all over Europe, especially in Germany. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration was set up in 1943 in New York, and now was trying to deal with the aftermath of the war. In May 1945, they advertised in Ireland for 25 doctors and the same number of nurses to be interviewed in Dublin. 100 applied, and Andy was the first to be appointed. He arrived in Lille, France in August, and after an initial induction, he became acting chief medical officer at Haren in Holland. That was a training base, and he was in charge of 300 medical personnel, male and female, of various nationalities. He was made chief medical officer in December. He was acting first, and then he was made chief, and he was highly commended by the director. In 1946, he was transferred to Germany and served in many locations, including Heidelberg, Wiesbaden and Kassel. And during the next 2 years, the system was changed, and their work came under the IRO, the International Refugee Organization, which had its headquarters in Geneva. And in 1948, he was given a senior position as Chief Medical Officer of Area Number 1 of the American Zone in Berlin. There were 150,000 displaced persons in that zone, in camps, varying in size from 1,000 to 8,000 people. And the medical people were in charge of trying to look after them and to stop outbreaks of disease in the camps. And during that time, he continued to correspond with his wife Frances, paid her half his salary, and visited home once a year. Excuse me. During his absence, Clonagh Publicta had been founded by Sean McBride and other comrades, Con Lehan and Simon Donnelly, and they became part of the inter-party government under Taoiseach John A. Costello. And a chance meeting with Sean McBride when he was on a trip home led to his return to the Hospital Commission. But it was a slimmed-down commission, and Andy expected to get the full-time position of chairperson. But instead, he was appointed an ordinary commissioner with a salary of £800 a year, which was part-time, which was a big come down from his final salary with the IRO, which was £2,400 tax-free. And also the Hospital Commission was much less important than under the previous government, as many of its functions were transferred to the Department of Health under Noel Brown. Now, during his life, Andy spoke at many public platforms. Here we have him speaking, I think it's probably his first one, which was in Tumivara in 1926, at the unveiling of a memorial to the Devaney brothers, Jim and Tom, who were both shot by the Black and Tans. And in 1933, he spoke at Dewach in Kerry, and at a ceremony in honour of some 6 North Kerry volunteers. Now, public speaking was a feature of 1930s politics, not only at election time, but even at other times, especially the radical people in Dublin used to have public speaking very often. And he shared platforms with Hannes Sheehy Skeffington, Moss Toomey, Sean McBride, Maud Gaughan and Helena Maloney. And in September 1937, he was chosen by the National Graves Association to unveil a plaque to Sean Tracy at Talbot Street in Dublin. And one of his last public engagements was in May 1950, when he formally opened the Lacan Memorial Park, Park Queenacon Foricirian, at Newport. And here we have a picture of him opening that, I hope, if this works. Sorry, Dennis, stuck again. Stuck again. No, we're gone back. We have to go forward, exactly. And as you can see, that's the picture that was used on the cover of the book. And that's Sean Gaynor and Andy at the opening. Now I have another picture of them here as well with a few more people that we hope we can identify. Well, that's Andy Cooney, Tom Barry. I think that's Sean Carroll from Castleconnell, Sean Gaynor, Father Murphy. I think that's Father Lee, who is parish priest of Newport, and I'm not sure who that was. Don't know if anybody else can recognise. Now the young man or the young boy, he looks like a young boy to me in front, is stated in the caption in the book to be Sean Cooney, Andy's son, but his widow now, Betty, disputes that. She thinks it couldn't possibly be Sean, that he looks too young, because he was 19 at that time, and if it's not he, well, we don't know who he is. Excuse me. And in 1950, even though he was still part of the Republican movement and mixing with old comrades and speaking on public platforms, and his private life was very unsettled, he was disappointed with his minor role in the Hospital Commission, and relations with his wife had deteriorated so much that he was completely estranged from her and their son. He decided to leave Ireland again, and he resigned from the Commission, and in his letter he implied that he was leaving to take up a lucrative position abroad, but in reality he had no job lined up. And he wrote to an old comrade, a Cavan man, Seamus Connaughty, who had been in jail with him, and asked him to sponsor him, and he left for America in December 1950. Now, it was just before that he came to our house because he was home for a final to say farewell to his relations and friends, excuse me. Now, going to America in 1950 was a different proposition to his other trips, but anyway, he told no one he was going. He didn't tell his wife or his son or Moss Toomey or anyone else. The only person he's told was his sister Maureen and her husband Jim Cleary, and they were the only ones who saw him off at the boat at Dunleary. And now, as I said, his visit was very different. Clonagale was still there, but many of the old powerful figures like Joe McGarrity were dead. And it was described, I think it was by Sean Cronin, Clonagale was described as consisting of ageing men with long memories and uncompromising principles. And he was not in an easy situation. He was 53 and his financial position was precarious. However, through friends and contacts from his German days, he got a temporary job in New Jersey, and that depended on his obtaining a license. And apparently the regulations for medical practice for license were different in different states. So he applied in Maryland. But he had to go back and study full-time for 6 months and do an exam. And his financial position was really precarious, and he wrote to the Department of Defense and asked them to send out his IRA pension. So he passed the exam, and he also did his American boards exam and became a consultant in chest medicine and a fellow of the American College of Chest Physicians. Now that he wasn't finally qualified to that standard till 1954. And this enabled him to take up a position as a staff physician in Mount Wilson Hospital, Pikesville, Maryland, the largest and most up-to-date TB hospital in that state. And while there, he became very friendly with a colleague, Dr. Michael Mayers, and his family, and they were a great support to him. He kept up contact with many old comrades through Clonagale and attended commemorations and dinners and spoke at some of them. And by 1960, he was looking forward to retiring, and he intended coming home for 6 months and staying at home for 6 months and staying in the States 6 months. But that was not to be. In December 1961, he suffered a massive stroke and was completely paralysed. Moss Toomey cabled a man in the Clonagale called Jean Sheehan to visit him and to report back. And this is what he reported. I found Andy sitting in a wheelchair. His right side is completely paralysed. His left hand he can move very little. He can hear, but he cannot speak. His speech is completely gone. I conversed with him through a blackboard with movable letters. It was a pretty bleak situation. He survived for 7 years. His speech improved somewhat, but he never recovered mobility. His son Sean happened to be on a business trip to America in 1962, and he went to visit him. And that reconciliation led to other visits. And also his sister Maureen visited him in 1965, and we see a picture of her here. That's Maureen and Andy. He looks quite cheerful, and those children belong to the mayor's family, and one of them was his godchild. And he was also actually visited by Liam Redmond while he was there. Now Liam Redmond was an actor, and he was married to a daughter of Thomas MacDonagh. Although he was well looked after medically and cared for by friends, it must have been a lonely existence, and he died on the 3rd of August 1968. Now, as usual, the IRA gave him a great send-off. At Kennedy Airport on the way home, his remains, accompanied by his son Sean, was met by a guard of honour of old IRA men, led by Tig Brosnan of Kerry and Bill Kavanagh of Tipperary. Now, I believe that Bill Kavanagh was also known as Cock Kavanagh, and he was from Nina, one of the family of the Abbey Iron Works. And I believe he was well known around here, and that he visited here in the 60s. And the prayers were recited by Michael Flannery of Knockshigowney, and a large tricolour wreath was laid on the casket by Hugh Kelly of Bursafarney, who had been a member of the Tumivara Greyhounds and the ASU, and had been with him at the attack on Bertha Kane Barracks 48 years previously. The funeral was met at Shannon by Father Murphy, PP Silvermines, and he who said the Mass in Nina the next day, and assisted by Father Cooney and Father Hillary, and Monsignor Hamilton presided. And interment was at Yochel, and the Reverend Father Brady, PVF Belfast, his brother-in-law, officiated at the graveside with Father Murphy. And the attendants included, as well as his family. Now his wife was at the funeral, and Sean and Maureen and her husband and the rest of the relations and friends. And included Colonel McGurk, who represented President de Valera, Tomás McGilla, who was then president of Sinn Féin, Tomás Malone and his wife, Eamon Devara, Mr. and Mrs. Mostoomey, Dr. Eileen McCarbon. Now she was a Cumann woman. She was Eileen McGrain, and she was head of Cumann in UCD when she was there. Dr. Louis and Tony Courtney, John Joe Sheehy, and District Justice Bill Sweetman. Now here we have a picture of the funeral passing down through Nina. I don't know who you can identify there. Now that's Jim Cleary, that's Sean Cooney, and I'm not sure who that man is. He could be his one of the Brady man, I'm not sure. That's Sean Slattery of Nina, that's Michael Conroy. And at the back, I think that's Paddy Harty, and that's Jack Harty behind him. Now, anybody know who that is? Is that Mostoomey by any chance? Anybody know? No? That's Denny O'Mara, Wolftown Terrace. That's Willie Heaney, who's right on the Guardian. That's the army man representing the president. And that's Joe Bergen of Nina. Now that man I know to see as well, but I can't remember what his name was. And we also have a picture of the funeral at the graveside. Now, you see again some of the same people, Michael Conroy, Jim Cleary, Sean Cooney, Cormac Brady, that's Father Brady, and I think that could be Father Murphy there behind him. I think that's Mostoomey sort of hidden there. That's Paddy Harty, isn't it, Tumivara? And and that's Pat Dwyer. I don't recognise him. Anybody recognise anyone else? That man there, or that man there?
Chris O'Halloran is
Pardon?
Chris O'Halloran is one of the children.
It's where is the man where?
One of the children.
There.
One of the children. One of the children.
One of the children. That's Larry.
Pardon? Oh, that's Larry Ryan. Oh, well, we know Larry Ryan. Yes, sorry. Yeah. I didn't think it necessary to point him out. He was young then. We were all fairly young in 1968, you know. There was of us who were there. But nobody knows him or him. That's it. I don't know them. I can't identify anyone else. Now, as I said in the beginning, Andy had a very eventful life, but ultimately I think it was a lonesome and a disappointing one in a lot of ways. But she never heard him page kere goramil mahake. I'd just like a few people before I finish off. I want to thank Imelda Spillane in particular because she sourced a lot of the family photographs for me. When I spoke to her first, I asked her, could she possibly get me a photo of Boss Cooney? And she wasn't at all sure. She was very doubtful that she would get one. But she not alone got one of Boss Cooney, but of his father, who was born in 1834 and died in 1930. And she got a lot of others. And I'd also like to thank Betty and his daughter-in-law Betty, who sent me a photograph, and his son Fergus, who lives in Scotland, who also sent me photographs. So only for that we wouldn't have any. And going to meet him for each.
Thanks very much, Cait. Well done. Great presentation. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question? Feel free to. I think Cait will answer any of your queries.
Sure, will I? Or I make a comment or add in anything, because there are lots of things that I don't know.
Fantastic talk. So well researched, to the treat not to listen to it. Just a comment in relation to the executions in Mountjoy. I came across a couple of accounts, let's say, about that, and we'll say a favourite thing at the time of the prisoners was that they regularly changed cells just to confuse the authorities in the jail, because there was a roll call being taken in each cell, in each landing every evening, and they used to do this regularly to try and just upset the roll call. And Pauline O'Keefe, who was the deputy governor at the time, he was known for his prolific tongue. Every second word was an expletive seemingly with him, and he had the job actually of collecting the four men that evening for the execution the following morning. And on two of the accounts that I found, he was actually looking for Andy Cooney, and he said that so-and-so Cooney is missing again. He said, Barrett, he said, you come instead. No, at the time, the men that were being taken away did not know why they were being taken. But he said, Barrett, you do instead. And some days afterwards, as OC of Sea Wing, Andy Cooney actually made himself paraded in front of Pauline with some demands. And Pauline's answer to him was, he said, you're so-and-so. He said, you're never there to be found. He said, but when I don't want to see you, he says, you're always so-and-so in front of me.
Well, very likely, I would say, yeah.
Thanks, John. Anybody else want to make a comment? We're okay. Again, Cait, thanks very much.